The November of 1891 had settled upon Baker Street with that peculiar combination of fog and melancholy, which seems to transform London into a city of shadows and whispered secrets. I had spent the better part of the morning absorbed in my correspondence when the familiar sound of hurried footsteps upon our 17 steps announced the arrival of what would prove to be one of our most perplexing cases. Holmes, who had been reclining in his favorite armchair, with the morning papers scattered about him like fallen leaves, raised his head with that sudden alertness I had come to recognize as the first stirring of his remarkable intellect. The visitor's approach had clearly caught his attention, for he set aside his pipe and fixed his keen grey eyes upon our door with an expression of anticipatory interest. Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock preceded the entrance of a man whose very appearance spoke of urgent distress and sleepless nights. He was perhaps 50 years of age, with the weathered complexion and steady bearing of one long accustomed to the sea's capricious moods. His dark coat bore the unmistakable marks of hasty travel. Salt stains upon the cuffs, mud upon the boots, and that particular dishevelment which comes from a night spent upon uncomfortable railway carriages. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice carrying the measured cadence of one accustomed to speaking above the wind and waves. "Indeed," Holmes replied, rising with courteous alacrity. "And you, sir, are recently arrived from the Dorset coast, Weymouth, I should venture, given the particular red clay upon your boots. You have come directly from the railway station, having travelled through the night, and your business concerns a matter of considerable urgency involving Trinity House and a lighthouse under your charge." Our visitor's eyes widened in astonishment, and he removed his hat with hands that trembled slightly. "How could you possibly—" "A simple matter of observation," Holmes interrupted with a dismissive wave. "The brass buttons upon your coat bear the distinctive anchor design of Trinity House, while the wear patterns suggest long service. The salt stains are fresh, indicating recent proximity to the sea, and the particular shade of clay upon your boots is found only in certain coastal regions of Dorset. Your evident fatigue and the urgency of your manner suggest a crisis requiring immediate attention. But pray, be seated and tell us what has brought you to Baker Street in such evident distress." The man sank into the chair Holmes indicated, clutching his hat as though it were an anchor in stormy seas. "My name is Captain Edmund Blackwood, keeper of Raven's Point Light on the Dorset coast. Mr. Holmes, I have witnessed something that defies all natural explanation, and I fear that unless the truth is discovered, an innocent man may hang for a crime that appears to have been committed by supernatural forces." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that particular intensity which invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Supernatural forces, you say? How refreshing. It has been some weeks since anyone has credited the criminal classes with otherworldly assistance. Pray continue, Captain Blackwood." "3 nights ago," Blackwood began, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his tale, "my assistant keeper, young Thomas Hartwell, was found dead at the base of Raven's Point Light. The circumstances were peculiar. The lighthouse door was bolted from within, the windows latched, and there was no sign of how his killer might have entered or departed. But that is not the strangest part of this affair." He paused, drawing a shuddering breath before continuing. "At precisely midnight on the night of Hartwell's death, the great fog bell of Raven's Point rang 12 times. Every soul in the village heard it, the coast guard, the fisherman, the harbour master. It rang clear and true across the water, as it has done for 40 years during times of thick weather." "And what makes this remarkable?" I interjected, though I suspected I knew the answer. Captain Blackwood turned to me with eyes that held a haunted quality. "Dr. Watson, the bell mechanism of Raven's Point Light was removed for repair a full week before Hartwell's death. The great bronze bell hangs silent in the tower. There is no clapper, no mechanism, no means by which it could sound. Yet every person within 3 miles heard it ring at midnight, just as Thomas Hartwell drew his last breath." Holmes had been listening with that peculiar stillness which indicated his mind was already racing ahead. considering possibilities and eliminating impossibilities with mechanical precision. "Most intriguing," he murmured. "And I assume the local constabulary has formed their own theory regarding this apparent impossibility." "Inspector Bradshaw from Weymouth believes that I murdered young Hartwell myself, and somehow contrived to ring the bell as a form of misdirection," Blackwood replied bitterly. "He cannot explain how the bell rang without its mechanism, but he is convinced that I am responsible. The evidence, he claims, points to no one else." "Evidence has a peculiar way of pointing in whatever direction the observer wishes to look," Holmes observed dryly. "Tell me, Captain, what was your relationship with the deceased? Was there any animosity between you?" "None whatsoever, Mr. Holmes. Thomas was like a son to me. I had trained him myself these past 2 years. He was steady, reliable, and devoted to his duties. I cannot imagine who would wish him harm, much less how they might have accomplished such a deed." Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street with that distant expression which indicated his remarkable mind was already at work upon the problem. "The bell," he said softly, "rings at midnight when it cannot ring. A man dies in a locked room with no apparent means of entry or escape. And the local authorities, faced with an impossibility, choose to ignore the impossible elements and focus upon the merely improbable." He turned back to face us, his eyes alight with the thrill of intellectual challenge. "Captain Blackwood, I believe your case presents several points of considerable interest. When did you say the bell mechanism was removed?" "A full week before the tragedy, Mr. Holmes. It was taken to the workshop in Weymouth for cleaning and repair of the striking mechanism." "And yet the bell rang 12 times at midnight," Holmes mused. "Watson, I believe we have encountered a problem worthy of our immediate attention. Captain, if you can arrange accommodation for us near Raven's Point, we shall depart for Dorset this very afternoon." As our visitor's weathered face broke into the first expression of hope I had seen since his arrival, I began gathering my medical bag and traveling case, wondering what strange mystery awaited us at the lighthouse that rang a bell after midnight. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was afoot, and this particular game promised to challenge even his extraordinary powers of deduction. "One final question, Captain," Holmes said as Blackwood prepared to depart. "This bell that rang at midnight, was there anything unusual about its tone or rhythm, any deviation from its normal pattern?" Blackwood paused, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Now that you mention it, Mr. Holmes, there was something different. The bell usually rings in groups of 3 during fog warnings, but that night it rang 12 times in succession, once for each stroke of midnight. It was as though someone was marking the hour rather than warning of danger." Holmes's thin smile held a note of satisfaction. "Excellent. That single detail may prove more valuable than all the physical evidence combined. Until this afternoon, then, Captain Blackwood." As our visitor departed, his step noticeably lighter than when he had arrived, Holmes turned to me with that expression of keen anticipation which invariably preceded our most memorable adventures. "Well, Watson, what do you make of our lighthouse keeper's tale?" "It seems impossible, Holmes. A bell without a clapper, a locked room, a murder without a murderer. It reads like something from a sensation novel." "Precisely why it intrigues me," Holmes replied, already reaching for his traveling coat. "In my experience, Watson, the impossible merely indicates that we have not yet discovered the possible, and I have never yet encountered a bell that could ring itself, nor a murderer who could vanish into thin air." He paused at the door, his hand upon the handle, and smiled that enigmatic smile which had become so familiar to me over our years of partnership. "Besides," he added, "I've always found lighthouses to be most illuminating places, in more ways than one." And with that cryptic observation, we prepared to embark upon what would prove to be one of the most challenging cases of our long association, a mystery that would test the very limits of logical deduction and reveal the dark secrets hidden within the beacon that should have stood as a symbol of safety and guidance. The fog that had shrouded Baker Street began to lift as we made our preparations for departure, though Holmes remained wrapped in that peculiar silence which invariably accompanied the first stirrings of a complex case. I observed him as he packed his traveling case with methodical precision, each item selected with the care of a surgeon choosing his instruments. The mystery of Raven's Point had clearly captured his imagination, and I knew from long experience that his mind was already racing ahead, constructing theories and discarding them with mechanical efficiency. Our hansom carried us through the familiar streets to Waterloo Station, where Holmes secured first-class accommodations on the afternoon express to Weymouth. As the train pulled away from London's grimy embrace, carrying us toward the Dorset coast, Holmes finally broke his contemplative silence. "Consider the essential elements, Watson," he began, his fingers drumming a precise 12-beat rhythm upon his knee. "A bell rings 12 times at midnight when it possesses no mechanism to ring. Either it rang or it did not. If it rang, something external struck it. If it did not ring, then every soul within 3 miles was deceived by some other sound. But surely an entire village cannot be mistaken about such a thing. Perhaps not mistaken. Misdirected. Sound plays curious tricks near the water, Watson. A ship's bell heard as a lighthouse bell, a fog signal mistaken for something else entirely." His keen eyes fixed upon a fellow passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged gentleman nervously consulting his pocket watch. Observe our anxious companion there. A clerk from the Admiralty, recently returned from Portsmouth, carrying dispatches he fears may have been compromised. I studied the man's unremarkable appearance. How can you possibly— the particular shade of blue upon his cuff. Admiralty ink, used exclusively for official correspondence. The salt stains upon his boots speak of recent proximity to naval installations. His nervous glances toward his dispatch case and the way he shields his papers from view suggest classified material. The slight tremor in his hands indicates anxiety rather than age. As if summoned by Holmes' observation, the gentleman rose hastily and moved to a more secluded compartment, clutching his case protectively. Holmes smiled with quiet satisfaction before returning to our discussion. "The bell, Watson, struck 12 times. Not the random pealing of a warning signal, but the deliberate marking of an hour. This suggests intention, a message rather than mere phantom sound." We reached Weymouth as the afternoon light began to fade, the salt air sharp with the promise of evening fog. Captain Blackwood awaited us on the platform, his weathered face showing both relief and grim determination. He led us to a waiting carriage, and soon we were rattling along the coastal road toward Raven's Point. "Inspector Bradshaw has been pressing his case," Blackwood explained as we traveled. "He's convinced I killed poor Thomas and somehow contrived the bell as misdirection. The man cannot explain how a bell without a clapper could ring, yet he insists I'm guilty." "And the village opinion?" "Divided, Mr. Holmes. Some whisper of supernatural warnings, others speak of smugglers returning to these waters. There was talk of a strange light seen offshore the night before Thomas died. The lighthouse came into view as we crested a hill, a white tower rising from rocky promontory, like an accusing finger against the darkening sky. Holmes studied it intently, his sharp eyes cataloguing every detail of its construction and surroundings. As we approached the structure, Holmes suddenly called for the carriage to halt. He alighted and knelt beside the gravelled path, producing his magnifying glass with practiced ease. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Captain, how many people have regular access to this lighthouse?" "Myself, Thomas, and perhaps a dozen others from Trinity House for inspections. Yet I count no fewer than 5 distinct sets of footprints made within recent days, including one set made very recently indeed." Holmes straightened, his eyes scanning the area with methodical precision. "Someone has been taking considerable interest in your lighthouse, Captain Blackwood." The interior examination revealed the locked room where Thomas Hartwell had met his end. Door bolted from within, windows latched, no apparent means of entry or escape. Holmes examined every surface with painstaking care, noting the overturned furniture and dark stains that spoke of violence. In the bell chamber at the tower's summit, the great bronze bell hung silent and motionless, its striking mechanism conspicuously absent, yet the metal itself perfect and resonant when Holmes tested it with his knuckles. Without the clapper and mechanism, it should be silent as a tomb, he observed, yet 3 nights ago it marked the hour of murder with 12 precise strokes. As evening settled over Raven's Point, Holmes's expression held that familiar gleam of intellectual challenge accepted. The morning mist clung to Raven's Point like a shroud, transforming the lighthouse into a spectral tower that seemed to float between sea and sky. Holmes had risen before dawn, and I discovered him at the base of the structure, his keen eyes examining the weathered stones with methodical precision. The salt air carried an unusual chill, and the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below provided a somber accompaniment to our investigation. "Most revealing, Watson," Holmes announced as I approached, his voice carrying that note of satisfaction which indicated significant discovery. "Observe these stones at the foundation. The mortar here has been recently disturbed, and these scratches in the granite speak of metal tools applied with considerable skill." He indicated subtle marks that would have escaped any ordinary observer. "Someone has been excavating beneath this lighthouse, carefully, methodically, and with every intention of avoiding detection." I knelt beside him, noting the traces of fresh earth hastily concealed among the rocks and the almost imperceptible loosening of several foundation stones. A tunnel? Precisely, though whether it serves as entrance or exit remains to be determined. Holmes straightened, his gaze traveling up the tower's imposing height. The locked room mystery begins to assume an entirely different character. Our examination was interrupted by the authoritative tread of heavy boots upon the rocky path. Inspector Bradshaw approached with evident irritation, his ruddy face bearing the expression of a man unaccustomed to having his conclusions questioned. He was accompanied by 2 constables whose suspicious glances suggested they viewed our presence as unwelcome interference. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume," Bradshaw began without preamble, consulting a leather notebook with theatrical authority. "I understand you've come from London to complicate a straightforward case of murder." "To illuminate it, Inspector. Nothing more," Holmes replied with diplomatic courtesy. "The circumstances surrounding young Hartwell's death present several points of considerable interest." Bradshaw's confidence was absolute. Captain Blackwood killed his assistant following an argument about lighthouse procedures. The evidence is clear: motive, opportunity, and access. This phantom bell nonsense is merely misdirection, the desperate invention of a guilty man. Holmes listened with apparent patience, though I detected the subtle tightening around his eyes that indicated growing skepticism. "And the locked room, Inspector? How do you account for a door bolted from within?" "Blackwood knows every inch of this lighthouse. There must be another way in or out that we haven't discovered." "Such as the tunnel I've just identified." Bradshaw's certainty wavered momentarily. "What tunnel?" Before Holmes could respond, we were interrupted by the arrival of a young woman whose obvious distress and hurried manner suggested urgent news. She was perhaps 25, with the practical dress and capable bearing of one accustomed to domestic responsibilities, yet her face bore the unmistakable marks of recent grief. "Captain Blackwood," she called breathlessly, "I must speak with you about Thomas, about what he discovered before his death." "Miss Sarah Hartwell," Blackwood explained as she approached our group. "Thomas's sister. You should not have come here, my dear. The strain—" "I can no longer remain silent," she interrupted, turning to address Holmes directly. "Thomas came to see me 2 nights before he died, Mr. Holmes. He was frightened. He'd seen unauthorized lights offshore and heard strange sounds beneath the lighthouse during his night watches. He believed someone was using the lighthouse for purposes other than navigation." Holmes's attention focused upon her with laser intensity. "What manner of purposes?" "Signaling to ships at sea, using patterns that weren't official maritime codes. Thomas had documented several instances in his private journal. She glanced nervously at Inspector Bradshaw. He also told me that the bell had rung once, very softly, around 11 o'clock the night before his death, but he thought he must have imagined it. The significance of this revelation was not lost on Holmes. The phantom bell had rung twice, once as a signal, once as a death knell. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming with the light of approaching comprehension. "Inspector, I suggest you examine the lighthouse's logbook with particular attention to the final entries. You may find the handwriting reveals more than the words themselves." As we prepared to return to the lighthouse for a more thorough examination, Holmes paused at the threshold, his sharp gaze encompassing the scene with renewed understanding. "The threads are beginning to form a pattern, Watson," he observed quietly. "A bell that rings without mechanism, a room locked from within, and now evidence of clandestine activities beneath our very feet. The truth, I suspect, lies not in supernatural explanations, but in the very human motives of greed and deception." The game was indeed afoot, and with each revelation, the mystery of Raven's Point deepened into something far more complex than a simple murder. The morning fog had lifted by the time Holmes proposed a more systematic examination of the lighthouse foundation. Captain Blackwood led us around the structure's base, where weathered granite blocks had withstood decades of Atlantic storms. Holmes moved with deliberate precision, his keen eyes cataloguing every irregularity in the ancient masonry. "Watson, observe these particular stones," he said, kneeling beside the seaward foundation. "The mortar here shows recent disturbance, and these scratches speak of metal tools applied with considerable care." His magnifying glass revealed subtle tool marks that would have escaped ordinary notice. Someone has been conducting excavations beneath this lighthouse, methodically and with every intention of avoiding detection. Inspector Bradshaw approached with evident skepticism, his notebook ready to record what he clearly expected to be another of Holmes's theatrical demonstrations. "Foundation repairs are common enough, Mr. Holmes. The sea takes its toll on these structures." "Indeed, but repairs leave different marks than clandestine excavations," Holmes replied, indicating several loosened blocks that had been skillfully replaced. "Captain, would you assist me with this particular stone?" Working together, we managed to shift a granite block that revealed a narrow opening descending into darkness. The passage was expertly constructed, its walls bearing the careful chisel marks of professional stonework rather than hasty excavation. Holmes lit his lantern and peered into the tunnel. "This extends well beyond the lighthouse foundation, quite possibly connecting to the natural cave system along these cliffs." He entered the passage, and we followed in single file through the cramped space. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber where Holmes's lantern illuminated evidence of recent occupation. Coils of rope lay neatly arranged, and the sandy floor bore the compressed marks of heavy objects being dragged repeatedly in the same direction. Most significantly, Holmes identified 3 distinct sets of footprints preserved in patches of damp sand. "Note the variety," he observed, indicating the impressions. "A broad working boot, a narrower gentleman's shoe, and this third with a distinctive wear pattern on the outer edge." None matched Captain Blackwood's footwear when compared. While Holmes examined the physical evidence, I studied Thomas Hartwell's private journal that his sister had provided. The young keeper's neat handwriting revealed growing anxiety in his final entries, with increasingly irregular pen strokes suggesting mounting tension. "Holmes, these margin notations are curious," I observed. "They appear decorative, but there's a pattern to them. Dots and dashes arranged with mathematical precision." Holmes examined the markings with immediate interest. Morse code, cleverly disguised as ornamental flourishes. Young Hartwell was more resourceful than his killer realized. He began transcribing the hidden message. "Strange signals midnight. 3 long flashes. 2 short. Response from below. Tunnel entrance discovered. Danger if exposed." The decoded message confirmed our tunnel discovery while revealing the systematic nature of Hartwell's observations. Holmes found additional evidence in the chamber, traces of tar on the walls at shoulder height, and metal filings that suggested recent mechanical work. Our investigation was interrupted by voices echoing from the tunnel entrance. We emerged to find Inspector Bradshaw questioning a weather-beaten fisherman whose nervous demeanor immediately attracted Holmes's attention. "Ezra Vane," Captain Blackwood explained. "Local fisherman, though his catches have been remarkably poor of late." Vane's pale eyes darted between us as he clutched his cap. "Just collecting driftwood, gentlemen. A man must make his living where he can." Holmes observed the man's damp sleeves and the faint aroma of spirits about his person. "Your boat is the Mercy Jane, I believe. She draws just enough water to navigate the shoals at high tide, quite useful for reaching secluded coves." "Every fisherman knows these waters," Vane replied defensively, but his discomfort was evident. "Indeed. Tell me, Mr. Vane, have you noticed any unusual shipping activity in recent weeks? Vessels using non-standard navigation patterns, perhaps?" Vane's hesitation was telling. "Ships come and go, not my business to question their courses." Holmes produced a small fragment of blue glass he had discovered in the tunnel. "Signal glass, the particular shade used for modified maritime communications, not standard Trinity House equipment." "Wreckage washes up constantly," Vane muttered, but his confidence was clearly shaken. Inspector Bradshaw, sensing an opportunity to redirect suspicion from Blackwood, pressed his advantage. "Mr. Vane, you will accompany us for further questioning. Your presence here requires explanation." As Vane was led away, Holmes turned his attention back to the lighthouse itself. In the bell chamber, his examination revealed minute metal filings near the mounting brackets and traces of oil on surfaces that should have been dry since the mechanism's removal. "The mystery deepens considerably," Holmes announced, his eyes gleaming with intellectual satisfaction. "Someone has been using this lighthouse for purposes far removed from maritime safety, and young Hartwell's growing awareness sealed his fate." The afternoon fog began rolling in from the Atlantic, and Holmes watched the approaching wall of mist with evident anticipation. "Tonight, Watson, I believe we shall witness the true purpose of Raven's Point Light, and perhaps solve the mystery of the bell that rang at midnight." The evening fog rolled in with unusual density, transforming Raven's Point into a world of muffled sounds and ghostly shapes. Inspector Bradshaw had spent the better part of the afternoon interrogating Ezra Vane in Captain Blackwood's cramped office, and when he finally emerged, his bearing carried the unmistakable satisfaction of a man convinced he had solved a perplexing case. "Well, Mr. Holmes," Bradshaw announced, consulting his leather notebook with theatrical authority, "your mysterious tunnel and phantom signals have proven to be nothing more than the apparatus of common smugglers. Vane has confessed to operating a contraband network for the past 6 months, using the lighthouse as a coordination point for offshore vessels." Holmes looked up from the detailed coastal chart he had been studying, his expression revealing neither surprise nor disappointment. "Indeed, Inspector. And young Hartwell's death?" "A tragic accident, nothing more," Bradshaw replied with evident pride in his deduction. Vane admits that Hartwell had discovered their activities and threatened exposure. In desperation, Vane and his accomplice used a crude slingshot mechanism to strike the bell from the cliffs below, hoping to frighten the young keeper into silence. The timing with midnight was purely coincidental, a desperate intimidation attempt that went tragically wrong. I found myself studying Holmes's reaction carefully, expecting some sharp rejoinder to what seemed an oversimplified explanation. Instead, he merely nodded thoughtfully, a faint smile playing about his lips that I had learned to recognize as a sign of deeper contemplation. "And the locked room, Inspector?" Hartwell panicked when he heard the bell, stumbled in the darkness, and fell within his quarters. The door bolt engaged by some mechanical fluke during his collapse. These old mechanisms are notoriously unreliable. Bradshaw's confidence was absolute. We're apprehending Vane's accomplice, one Silas Croft, as we speak. The case is effectively closed, Mr. Holmes." As Bradshaw departed to oversee the arrest, Holmes remained unusually quiet, his keen eyes fixed upon the lighthouse tower with an intensity that suggested his mind was working through possibilities the inspector had never considered. The fog continued to thicken, and soon the great light itself became merely a dim glow in the gathering darkness. "Watson," Holmes said finally, "I believe a final examination of the bell chamber is warranted. The inspector's theory, while admirably straightforward, leaves several questions unanswered." We ascended the spiral staircase through increasingly dense fog that seemed to muffle even our footsteps. In the lantern room, Holmes moved with methodical precision, examining every surface with his magnifying glass, while I held a flickering candle to provide illumination. He paid particular attention to the window frames and door mechanisms, testing the bolt repeatedly with the careful touch of a craftsman evaluating fine machinery. At the platform's edge, Holmes lay prone and peered over the precipitous drop to the rocks below, remaining motionless for several long minutes. When he finally rose, his expression held that particular satisfaction I had learned to associate with significant discovery. His examination of the great bronze bell itself was extraordinarily thorough. He ran his hands along its surface, not merely feeling for vibrations, but studying the patina and wear patterns with scientific precision. Producing a small mirror from his pocket, he angled it to reflect candlelight into the bell's deepest recesses, his face illuminated by the dancing flame as he searched for something specific. Whatever he found there caused a momentary change in his expression, a fleeting look of profound understanding that he quickly concealed. He then turned his attention to the door's bolt mechanism, running his finger along the grooves and examining the latch with minute care. I watched as he pressed a small piece of lint against a specific point on the bolt, then carefully removed it and placed it in an envelope with the precision of a chemist handling a crucial specimen. "The inspector's theory possesses a certain elegant simplicity," Holmes remarked as we descended through the fog-shrouded staircase. "Yet simplicity, while often the hallmark of truth, can also serve as camouflage for more complex realities. Some truths, Watson, are too inconvenient to be simple." He offered no further explanation, though I sensed he had discovered something that fundamentally undermined Bradshaw's confident conclusions. As we returned to our temporary lodgings through the thick fog, Holmes paused at the lighthouse base and requested an unusual favor. "Watson, might I borrow your stethoscope this evening? I have need to listen to something that prefers not to be heard." The cryptic request, combined with his secretive behavior in the bell chamber, convinced me that Holmes had uncovered a crucial element of the mystery that he was deliberately withholding. His silence, I had learned through long experience, was often his most eloquent declaration that the game was far from over. The fog continued to thicken around Raven's Point, and somewhere in its concealing embrace, I suspected, lay the truth that would expose Inspector Bradshaw's premature certainty as merely another false lead in the complex web of deception surrounding the lighthouse that rang a bell after midnight. The fog that enveloped Raven's Point that evening was of such density that it seemed to muffle not merely sound and sight, but the very passage of time itself. Holmes had spent the better part of the afternoon in restless preparation, assembling a curious collection of scientific instruments that included my borrowed stethoscope, several lengths of silk thread, and a small vial of fine powder that he refused to identify beyond calling it a most sensitive indicator of mechanical disturbance. As darkness fell, Holmes led me through the treacherous fog to the lighthouse, where he began what could only be described as the most methodical acoustic investigation I had ever witnessed. In the bell chamber, he pressed the stethoscope against various points of the mounting apparatus with the precision of a physician examining a patient's heart. "Most illuminating, Watson," he murmured, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "There is indeed a mechanical pulse within this ironwork, faint but unmistakably regular. Someone has installed a device of considerable sophistication, one designed to create vibrations that would resonate through the bell's bronze without requiring the traditional clapper mechanism. He proceeded to attach nearly invisible silk threads across the door bolt and window latches, then dusted certain surfaces with his mysterious powder. If these indicators are disturbed before midnight, we shall have proof of unauthorized access, he explained with characteristic precision. Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Bradshaw, whose bearing carried the unmistakable satisfaction of a man convinced he had solved a complex case through simple deduction. "Your theatrical methods are no longer required, Mr. Holmes," Bradshaw announced with evident pride. "Silas Croft has hanged himself in his cell, leaving a complete confession. He admits to using a crude mechanical device to strike the bell as intimidation, hoping to frighten young Hartwell into silence about their smuggling operations. The case is closed." Holmes examined the crumpled confession with unusual interest, his keen eyes scanning every line with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. When he returned the document, his expression held that peculiar mixture of amusement and contempt I had learned to associate with his encounters with official incompetence. "Observe, Watson, the spelling of Lanthorn with an H, the archaic maritime form, yet Croft, a man of the shore, would never employ such antiquated spelling. This document was prepared by someone with classical education, not a common smuggler." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Dead men make convenient scapegoats, Inspector, but they also make unreliable witnesses." As midnight approached, Holmes positioned us in the lighthouse chamber with strategic precision. He had darkened the room completely, save for a small shaded lantern, and his stethoscope remained pressed against the bell mounting throughout our vigil. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the only sounds were the distant crash of waves and the steady ticking of the tower clock. At precisely midnight, the great bell began to ring. The sound was unmistakably authentic. 12 clear, resonant strokes that carried across the water with supernatural clarity. Yet Holmes's silk threads remained undisturbed, and his powder showed no signs of interference. Through his stethoscope, however, Holmes detected something extraordinary. "The vibrations originate not from impact, Watson, but from within the mounting system itself," he whispered between strokes. "Someone has installed a mechanical resonator, a device that creates sympathetic vibrations in the bronze without requiring external percussion. Ingenious beyond measure." As the 12th stroke faded, Holmes produced a small blue glass filter and briefly uncovered his lantern, sending a coded signal seaward. Almost immediately, an answering flash appeared through the fog, confirming the presence of a vessel maintaining position offshore. "The bell serves as both signal and camouflage," Holmes explained as we prepared to depart. "Its apparent impossibility diverts attention from the very real criminal enterprise it coordinates. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall discover who possesses both the technical knowledge and criminal motivation to construct such an elaborate deception." The fog began to lift as we returned to our lodgings, revealing the lighthouse beacon cutting through the darkness like an accusing finger. Somewhere in that tower lay the final pieces of a puzzle far more sophisticated than Inspector Bradshaw's simple smuggling theory could encompass. The morning fog had lifted sufficiently to reveal the full extent of the previous night's revelations, yet Holmes appeared more troubled than triumphant as we examined the lighthouse foundation by daylight. His methodical inspection of the tunnel entrance revealed subtle signs that someone had attempted to conceal recent disturbances. Fresh mortar hastily applied, and stone dust carefully swept away with almost professional precision. "Watson, observe these tool marks," Holmes said, kneeling beside the entrance with his magnifying glass. "The craftsmanship speaks of someone with considerable experience in both engineering and deception. These are not the crude excavations of common smugglers, but the precise work of a trained professional." Our examination was interrupted by the hurried approach of Miss Sarah Hartwell, whose pale countenance and evident distress suggested she bore news of considerable import. She clutched a leather portfolio against her chest, with protective urgency, her eyes darting nervously toward the lighthouse tower. "Mr. Holmes," she began breathlessly, "a gentleman called at my cottage before dawn, claiming to represent Trinity House. He presented credentials identifying himself as Inspector Tolland and demanded Thomas's remaining papers for the official investigation. When I hesitated, he became most insistent, speaking of the necessity of recovering all materials related to the lighthouse operations." Holmes's attention sharpened immediately. "Describe this gentleman, if you please." "A man of perhaps 40 years, well dressed in a dark coat of excellent material. He carried himself with the bearing of education and authority, yet something in his manner seemed rehearsed. He spoke of the bell mechanism using the term lanthorn, an odd old-fashioned word I had never heard applied to lighthouse equipment. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "The use of lanthorn with an H reveals classical education, not the vocabulary of a typical Trinity House inspector. Did you surrender the materials?" "I did not, Mr. Holmes. Something about his urgency troubled me, and I claimed the papers were with my solicitor. He departed hastily, but not before I observed him examining the cottage's exterior with unusual interest, as though memorizing its construction." Miss Hartwell opened her portfolio to reveal additional sketches and notes from her brother's private collection. "I discovered these hidden in Thomas's sea chest. They document systematic irregularities at several coastal installations. Fog signals failing during critical weather, navigation lights extinguished at precisely timed intervals, and bell mechanisms producing unauthorized sounds." Holmes studied the meticulous drawings with growing fascination. The sketches revealed technical diagrams of considerable sophistication, showing modified bell-striking apparatus and acoustic resonators that could produce sound without traditional mechanical contact. Young Hartwell had been documenting not mere smuggling activities, but a coordinated assault on maritime safety systems. "Your brother had uncovered evidence of an enterprise far more sinister than simple contraband," Holmes observed grimly. "These modifications require intimate knowledge of lighthouse engineering and access to specialized equipment. We are dealing with someone of considerable technical expertise and criminal ambition." As we prepared to return to the lighthouse for further investigation, a dull concussion echoed from beneath our feet, followed by a shower of dust and debris from the tunnel entrance. The carefully constructed passage had partially collapsed, sealing the underground route with calculated precision. Holmes examined the rubble with intense concentration, retrieving fragments of brass mechanism and traces of an explosive compound that spoke of deliberate sabotage. "Our adversary has decided to eliminate evidence," Holmes announced, his voice carrying a note of cold determination. "The collapse is too precise to be accidental. Someone with intimate knowledge of the tunnel's construction has sealed it permanently." From within the settling debris came the sound of muffled voices, and presently Ezra Vane emerged, bloodied but conscious, supported by another man whose appearance immediately commanded Holmes's attention. The stranger was well dressed, with the bearing of education and authority, yet his presence in the collapsed tunnel raised obvious questions about his involvement in the night's activities. "Gentlemen," Holmes said quietly, his keen eyes fixed upon the newcomer, "I believe we are about to discover the true scope of the enterprise that cost young Hartwell his life. The bell that rang at midnight was not supernatural warning, but a sophisticated signal in a criminal network that threatens the safety of every vessel along these shores." The morning mist continued to lift from Raven's Point, yet the mystery had only deepened, revealing the shadowy outline of a conspiracy far more complex and dangerous than any of us had initially imagined. The man who emerged from the settling dust and debris carried himself with the practiced composure of one accustomed to authority, despite the rubble clinging to his expensive overcoat. He removed his hat with deliberate courtesy, revealing a narrow, intelligent face marked by the pallor of recent exertion, and offered an engraved calling card with the fluid gesture of established breeding. "Inspector Percival Tolland of Trinity House," he announced, his voice carrying the measured cadence of institutional authority. "I regret this unfortunate accident occurred during my inspection of these irregular excavations. Mr. Vane here was assisting me in documenting the extent of the unauthorized construction." Holmes accepted the proffered card without examining it, his keen attention focused instead upon subtle details that would have escaped ordinary observation. A faint yellow smear upon Tolland's right cuff caught his notice, and with characteristic precision he raised the merest trace to his nostrils. The sharp, distinctive aroma confirmed his suspicion. Nitrogelatin, still fresh upon the fabric. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, his voice pitched for my ears alone. "Our inspector possesses recent familiarity with explosive compounds." Miss Hartwell stepped forward, her face flushed with recognition and mounting indignation. "This is precisely the gentleman who appeared at my cottage before dawn, Mr. Holmes, demanding Thomas's papers with most unseemly urgency." Tolland inclined his head with unruffled courtesy. "As is entirely proper, Miss Hartwell. The records of a deceased keeper remain the property of Trinity House, and their secure custody concerns the safety of every vessel along these shores." Inspector Bradshaw arrived with evident relief at finding official reinforcement for his investigation. "Mr. Holmes, you perceive we are now in competent hands. The smuggling network has been thoroughly exposed, and Mr. Vane's underground activities have literally collapsed upon themselves." Holmes studied Tolland with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize as the prelude to devastating analysis. His gaze lingered upon the man's boots, noting the distinctive metal reinforcement upon the right heel. 3 screws arranged in a triangular pattern that would leave unmistakable impressions in soft ground. "Your movements since yesterday interest me considerably, Inspector Tolland," Holmes observed with deceptive casualness. "The timing of your arrival suggests remarkable prescience regarding these developments. From London by the afternoon express, a hired trap to Ravens Point, and systematic inspection of the lighthouse installations," Tolland replied with practiced ease. "My visit to Miss Hartwell at first light was entirely routine. Trinity House requires comprehensive documentation in cases involving keeper fatalities." Holmes produced a small envelope from his coat, containing the peculiar grease sample he had collected from the lighthouse bolt mechanism. "Before we accept convenient explanations, Inspector, perhaps you might examine this substance. It represents not common lubricant, but a specialized watchmaker's compound, graphite and whale oil, employed exclusively for delicate escapement mechanisms." The significance was not lost upon anyone present. Whoever had manipulated the lighthouse door possessed intimate knowledge of precision machinery, far beyond the crude skills attributed to common smugglers. A breathless Coast Guard runner arrived bearing an urgent telegram for Inspector Bradshaw. As the local official read the message, the color drained from his weathered features with alarming rapidity. "The prison surgeon at Weymouth," Bradshaw announced in a shaken voice. "Silas Croft's death was not suicide. The hyoid bone shows fracture patterns consistent with strangulation, and there are contusions behind the ear indicating he was struck unconscious before hanging. So our convenient confessor was murdered and then arranged to appear self-destroyed," Holmes observed grimly. "It perfects an admirably tidy narrative while serving the truth not at all." Tolland's expression remained composed, though I detected a subtle tightening around his eyes. Smuggling activities remain evident regardless of Croft's unfortunate end. Trinity House will pursue its own comprehensive investigation into these coastal irregularities. Holmes withdrew a folded paper from his traveling case, one of the technical diagrams Miss Hartwell had discovered among her brother's effects. "These sketches document systematic modifications to lighthouse equipment along the entire Dorset coast, Inspector. The work requires not merely technical expertise, but institutional access and authority sufficient to avoid suspicion." "Young Hartwell was conducting unauthorized investigations," Tolland replied smoothly. "His amateur theories hardly constitute reliable evidence." "Perhaps not," Holmes agreed. Yet his documentation reveals a pattern of coordinated sabotage that extends far beyond simple contraband operations. The bell mechanism at Raven's Point represents months of careful planning and sophisticated engineering, work that could only be accomplished by someone with intimate knowledge of Trinity House procedures. Miss Hartwell clutched her leather portfolio protectively as she addressed our group. "I discovered this pinned to my cottage gate upon returning from the lighthouse." She produced a folded note written in an educated hand. "Return the ledger by nightfall, or the bell tolls for you." Holmes examined the paper with evident satisfaction, holding it to the light to study the watermark. "Excellent quality, H. Black & Son, Chancery Lane. Legal stationers of the finest reputation. Few fishermen compose their threats upon such distinguished paper." The morning fog continued to lift from Raven's Point, yet the mystery had only deepened with each revelation. Holmes's expression held that familiar gleam of intellectual challenge accepted, though I sensed he was deliberately withholding crucial deductions until the proper moment for complete exposure. "The threads are beginning to form a most interesting pattern," Holmes announced, his voice carrying a note of cold satisfaction. "A bell that rings without mechanism, a murdered scapegoat with a forged confession, and now a tunnel destroyed at precisely the moment of discovery. We are dealing with a mind that prefers mechanical precision to crude violence, and possesses both the knowledge and authority to execute such elaborate deceptions." As Inspector Tolland prepared to depart, ostensibly to coordinate with Trinity House authorities, Holmes called after him with apparent casualness. "One final observation, Inspector. Your right heel will leave a most distinctive impression in damp sand, quite useful for tracking recent movements around coastal installations." The game was indeed approaching its climax, and I sensed that the final revelations would prove more shocking than any of us had yet imagined. The afternoon brought developments that would transform our understanding of the Raven's Point conspiracy from mere criminal enterprise to elaborate deception of unprecedented sophistication. Holmes had spent the morning hours in apparent contemplation, yet I recognized the signs of intense mental calculation beneath his placid exterior as he observed the lighthouse tower with systematic precision. Our investigation received crucial validation through the unexpected arrival of Inspector Morrison, a genuine Trinity House official whose weathered features and practical manner contrasted sharply with yesterday's polished visitor. He carried authentic documentation that immediately exposed the fraudulent nature of Tolland's credentials. "No Inspector Tolland exists within Trinity House records," Morrison announced bluntly, consulting his leather-bound register with obvious authority. "These modifications to your lighthouse equipment represent unauthorized tampering of the most serious nature, requiring months of careful preparation and intimate knowledge of our operational procedures." Holmes examined Morrison's genuine credentials with evident satisfaction before sharing his own technical discoveries. Within the bell-mounting apparatus, concealed behind carefully painted metalwork, lay an ingenious acoustic resonator, a device that could create sympathetic vibrations in the bronze bell without requiring traditional percussion mechanisms. "Observe this copper wire, cunningly disguised as aged metal," Holmes explained, tracing the nearly invisible line that descended into the lighthouse's interior walls. "It connects to a galvanic battery and precision timing mechanism hidden within the oil storage chamber. A current applied at specific intervals creates resonant frequencies that cause the bell to ring with supernatural clarity." Morrison's examination confirmed the sophisticated engineering involved. This represents considerable financial investment and technical expertise far beyond common criminal capabilities. The perpetrator possesses legitimate professional background in maritime engineering. Holmes had prepared his own detection system with characteristic ingenuity. From his traveling case, he produced a strip of the finest silver foil, which he carefully positioned within the electrical circuit using ivory pins for insulation. "The merest current will fuse this delicate metal," he explained, placing a treated paper behind the foil. When our adversary attempts his midnight signal, the resulting smoke will deposit his electrical fingerprint upon this surface, providing irrefutable evidence of mechanical manipulation. As evening approached, Holmes orchestrated our positions with military precision. Inspector Bradshaw, now thoroughly convinced of the case's complexity following the prison surgeon's revelations about Croft's murder, positioned constables at strategic points around the lighthouse perimeter. Morrison arranged for Trinity House personnel to monitor coastal installations, while the Coast Guard prepared vessels to intercept any offshore activity. Holmes himself donned the weathered clothing of a local fisherman, transforming his appearance with the practiced skill I had witnessed countless times. His keen eyes surveyed the thickening fog with obvious satisfaction as it provided perfect cover for the evening's anticipated confrontation. "Tonight, Watson, we shall witness the culmination of our adversary's elaborate scheme," he declared, his voice carrying that note of cold anticipation which invariably preceded his most dramatic revelations. The false inspector's desperate attempts to recover evidence suggest the operation approaches a critical phase that cannot be postponed. Miss Hartwell had been safely relocated to inland accommodation, though not before Holmes had dictated a carefully worded response to the anonymous threat regarding her brother's papers. The message, written in her distinctive script, proposed surrendering the ledger at the lighthouse door precisely at midnight, a proposition designed to draw our quarry into the open. As darkness settled over Raven's Point, Holmes positioned us within the bell chamber with tactical precision. His silver foil detection system lay ready, while his stethoscope remained pressed against the mounting apparatus to monitor any mechanical activity. The fog pressed against the windows like a living entity, transforming familiar surroundings into an alien landscape of muffled sounds and ghostly shapes. At precisely 11:45, Holmes detected the first stirrings of electrical activity through his stethoscope. "The mechanism activates," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Our adversary maintains his schedule with mechanical precision." The great bell began its supernatural ringing. Not the 12 strokes of midnight, but a complex pattern of signals that carried across the water with unmistakable purpose. Through his telescope, Holmes observed answering flashes from multiple points offshore, confirming the presence of a coordinated fleet maintaining position within the concealing fog. "The network reveals itself completely," Holmes murmured with grim satisfaction as his silver foil fused and deposited its telltale residue upon the treated paper. "We now possess physical evidence of the electrical manipulation, while the offshore signals confirm the conspiracy's true scope." Our vigil was interrupted by the sound of cautious footsteps upon the lighthouse stairs, measured, deliberate, and attempting concealment. Holmes raised his hand for absolute silence as we listened to someone ascending with intimate knowledge of the tower's construction, avoiding the boards that would creak under pressure. The bell chamber door handle turned with agonizing slowness, and through this slight opening appeared the narrow, intelligent face we had encountered as Inspector Tolland. His eyes widened with shock at finding us positioned in waiting, yet his composure remained remarkably intact, even in the face of exposure. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, his cultured voice carrying no trace of surprise despite the obvious failure of his carefully laid plans. "I believe we have reached the conclusion of our elaborate dance." Holmes rose from his concealment with fluid grace, his revolver steady in his hand, yet held with casual authority rather than threatening aggression. "Indeed we have. Though I suspect the final movements remain to be performed, you will oblige me by stepping fully into the chamber and placing your hands where they may be clearly observed." The man who had called himself Inspector Tolland complied with elegant resignation, his movements suggesting one accustomed to command rather than capture. Yet even in defeat, his bearing retained that quality of intellectual pride which marked him as a worthy adversary for Holmes's remarkable deductive powers. "You have been most thorough, Mr. Holmes," he observed with genuine admiration. though I confess curiosity regarding the precise moment when my deception became apparent to your remarkable mind." Holmes smiled with cold satisfaction as the sound of approaching boots echoed from the stairway below. "The moment you employed the archaic spelling of Lanthorn, sir. Classical education leaves distinctive traces, just as your modified boot heel has left its triangular signature in the sand below." Inspector Bradshaw burst into the chamber with evident relief, followed by Morrison and two constables whose expressions reflected the gravity of the situation they had helped to resolve. "In the Queen's name," Bradshaw announced with official authority, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, sabotage, and the murder of Thomas Hartwell and Silas Croft." As the manacles closed upon his wrists, our prisoner's composure finally cracked slightly, revealing beneath the polished exterior a glimpse of the desperate intelligence that had conceived and executed such an elaborate deception. "The game concludes, Watson," Holmes observed quietly as our captive was led away. "Yet the full extent of this maritime conspiracy remains to be revealed. Tomorrow shall bring the complete exposition of how a bell that could not ring became the instrument of murder, and the signal for a criminal network that threatened the safety of every vessel along these shores." The gray dawn that broke over Raven's Point revealed the lighthouse standing sentinel against a calm sea, its malevolent secrets finally exposed to the harsh light of justice. Holmes had spent the early hours arranging his evidence with the methodical precision of a master craftsman, while our prisoner, who had finally revealed his true identity as Dr. Marcus Whitmore, formerly of the Royal Naval College, sat in Captain Blackwood's office with the resigned dignity of a man whose elaborate schemes had been thoroughly dismantled. The technical deception revealed. Holmes began his exposition with characteristic authority, addressing our assembled company of Inspector Bradshaw, Inspector Morrison, Miss Hartwell, and the Coast Guard Lieutenant. "We shall examine this matter in its logical sequence," he announced, producing the copper wire and galvanic apparatus recovered from the bell chamber. "First, the bell that could not ring, yet did. Observe this conductor, cunningly disguised with artificial patina to resemble aged metal." He demonstrated how the nearly invisible copper wire descended through the lighthouse's interior walls, connecting to a precision timing mechanism concealed within the oil storage chamber. A galvanic current applied at specific intervals creates resonant vibrations in the bronze bell without requiring traditional percussion. Hence 12 clear strokes at midnight, audible across 3 miles of water, yet accomplished without clapper or hammer. The silver foil detection system Holmes had employed bore the telltale deposit of vaporized metal, providing irrefutable proof of electrical manipulation. No supernatural force created these marks, Holmes observed with satisfaction. Only human ingenuity applied to criminal purpose. The locked room mystery solved. Moving to the door of Hartwell's chamber, Holmes revealed his most elegant deduction. With delicate precision, he traced a hairline slot cunningly concealed beneath the bolt's housing, then drew from the skirting below a loop of catgut so fine it resembled spider silk. Dr. Whitmore entered through the tunnel, struck young Hartwell behind the left ear, and withdrew to the passage below, Holmes explained methodically. Standing outside the locked door, he employed this line, which rides in the concealed channel to manipulate the bolt's tongue. The graphite and whale oil compound I identified ensured silent operation. Once the bolt engaged, the line was tugged free and concealed. Inspector Morrison examined the mechanism with growing amazement. The engineering sophistication required months of preparation and intimate knowledge of lighthouse construction. The true conspiracy. Exposed. Dr. Whitmore listened with evident appreciation for Holmes's analytical prowess, though his cultured features remained composed despite the gravity of his circumstances. When pressed for explanation, Holmes revealed the conspiracy's shocking scope. This network was not engaged in mere smuggling, Holmes declared grimly. Dr. Whitmore orchestrated systematic wrecking operations, deliberately disabling navigation aids to force valuable cargo vessels onto predetermined reefs where Confederates could salvage their contents under the guise of legitimate rescue operations. The evidence was overwhelming. Shipping manifests recovered from Whitmore's lodgings documented planned arrivals of valuable vessels and their intended destruction upon carefully mapped reef systems. The bell's midnight ringing served as coordination signals for offshore fleets, while different patterns communicated weather conditions and vessel approach times. Young Hartwell's private journal, with its seemingly decorative Morse code notations, had documented the entire operation. Holmes continued, his voice carrying cold satisfaction. His growing awareness of the systematic nature of these accidents sealed his fate. Dr. Whitmore murdered him to preserve a criminal enterprise that threatened the fundamental trust upon which maritime commerce depends. The villain's motivation. Dr. Whitmore finally spoke, his voice carrying the measured cadence of academic discourse despite his desperate circumstances. "You have been most thorough, Mr. Holmes. I confess professional curiosity regarding the precise moment when my carefully constructed identity became suspect. Your classical education betrayed you repeatedly," Holmes replied with icy contempt. "The archaic spelling of Lanthorn in Croft's forged confession, the Chancery Lane stationer's paper for your threatening note, and most significantly, your intimate knowledge of lighthouse terminology that no genuine Trinity House inspector would possess. You demonstrated too much specialized knowledge while lacking practical experience." Holmes revealed that Whitmore's dismissal from the Royal Naval College following accusations of unauthorized experimentation had provided both motive and opportunity. Technical expertise divorced from moral constraint becomes an instrument of destruction rather than progress, he observed philosophically. Resolution and aftermath. Miss Hartwell, present to witness her brother's vindication, listened with tears streaming down her pale cheeks as the full extent of Thomas's courage became apparent. "Your brother died protecting innocent mariners from deliberate wrecking operations," Holmes assured her gently. "His sacrifice prevented countless tragedies." Captain Blackwood, his reputation restored and his grief somewhat assuaged, expressed profound gratitude for Holmes's intervention. "Without your remarkable deductive powers, Mr. Holmes, an innocent man would have hanged while the true conspiracy continued its destructive work." As the constables prepared to transport Dr. Whitmore to await trial, Holmes addressed our company with characteristic reflection. "This case demonstrates how apparent impossibility often masks very real criminal enterprise. The bell that rang at midnight was not supernatural warning, but human greed disguised as mystery." Holmes's final observations. As we prepared to depart Ravens Point, Holmes paused at the lighthouse threshold, his keen eyes surveying the scene with characteristic detachment. "The game concludes satisfactorily, Watson, though I confess disappointment that such elaborate technical deception served merely pedestrian criminal purposes. I had hoped for greater intellectual challenge from an adversary of Dr. Whitmore's evident capabilities." The fog had lifted completely from the Dorset coast, revealing Ravens Point Light standing proud against the morning sky, once again a beacon of safety rather than instrument of destruction. Its great bell would remain silent until legitimate maritime emergencies required its honest voice to carry warnings across the dangerous waters. No longer the tool of a criminal conspiracy that had transformed symbols of maritime safety into instruments of calculated destruction. In the end, Holmes mused as our train carried us back toward London, the most sophisticated deception cannot long withstand systematic observation and logical analysis. The impossible merely indicates that we have not yet discovered the possible, and there is no mystery, however elaborate, that cannot yield to patient investigation and clear reasoning. Thus concluded the case of the lighthouse that rang a bell after midnight, a mystery that had challenged even Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction while revealing the dark potential of technical knowledge applied to criminal purpose. The days following Dr. Whitmore's arrest were occupied with that prosaic labor which inevitably succeeds the drama of detection. Trinity House engineers arrived from Portsmouth bearing coils of cable and precision instruments, and under Inspector Morrison's methodical direction, the acoustic resonator was dismantled with surgical care. Each disguised wire was stripped from the lighthouse walls, every trace of the elaborate deception catalogued as evidence for the approaching trial. Captain Blackwood, his reputation restored and his grief somewhat assuaged by the truth, supervised these proceedings with the grave dignity befitting his long service. He stood for considerable time beneath the great bronze bell, his weathered hand upon its silent surface, as though assuring himself that the instrument had returned to its rightful purpose of maritime safety rather than criminal coordination. At the coroner's inquiry, Holmes delivered his evidence with that measured clarity which leaves no refuge for sophistry or doubt. The hidden slot in the bolt housing, the telltale smear of graphite and whale oil, the distinctive triangular pattern of Whitmore's modified heel, and the electrical residue upon the fused silver foil formed an unbreakable chain of proof that even Inspector Bradshaw could not affect to ignore. To the man's credit, he approached Holmes afterward with a stiff handshake and the muttered admission that the phantom bell deceived us all. His official report, I later learned, accorded Holmes a grudging paragraph while devoting 3 pages to the county constabulary's efforts, yet even that represented progress in our relations with local authority. Ezra Vane, whose furtive maritime activities had initially suggested common smuggling, proved to be merely a small figure in Whitmore's larger design. His confession revealed systematic message-carrying and guidance of vessels through treacherous shoals, yet his genuine terror when confronted with Croft's murdered fate convinced even Bradshaw of his peripheral involvement. The unfortunate Croft had been silenced by Whitmore's gloved hand, acting through confederates within the prison system, a detail that emerged when the prison surgeon's testimony regarding strangulation was reinforced by traces of explosive compound found upon a guard's uniform. Miss Sarah Hartwell received the bitter consolation of her brother's vindication, along with a modest pension granted by Trinity House in recognition of Thomas's ultimate sacrifice. Morrison arranged for the young keeper's careful diagrams to be circulated among lighthouse personnel as both instruction and warning against future sabotage. Holmes, with characteristic discretion, ensured that Thomas's decoded journal entries were preserved in a leather binding marked with a fragment of the blue signal glass, a memorial to courage that had cost the lad his life. During our return journey to London, Holmes revealed the precise sequence of his deductions with that languid satisfaction which follows successful resolution. "The bell's voice provided the first discord, Watson," he explained, stretching his long frame across the railway compartment. "Fog signals speak in groups of 3. This one marked the hour with deliberate precision. The patina bore traces of recent mounting modifications, while metal filings beneath the brackets suggested mechanical installation rather than routine maintenance." His keen eyes held that familiar gleam of intellectual satisfaction. Add the graphite compound upon the bolt mechanism, the triangular heel impressions in the sand, and Whitmore's classical education betrayed through archaic spelling, and the impossible became merely ingenious. The stethoscope allowed me to hear the mechanical heartbeat concealed within bronze and iron. Inspector Morrison's subsequent investigations revealed the conspiracy's troubling scope. Similar modifications discovered at coastal installations from Beachy Head to Start Point, suggesting a coordinated network that threatened maritime safety along England's entire southern approach. Yet Whitmore's capture had apparently triggered systematic evidence destruction by remaining Confederates, limiting the full extent of prosecutions. As our train carried us through the familiar countryside toward London, Holmes fell into that philosophical mood which often followed our most significant cases. "The most dangerous criminals, Watson, are those who marry technical brilliance to moral bankruptcy," he observed, watching the evening landscape through our compartment window. Dr. Whitmore possessed the knowledge to preserve life and guide vessels safely to harbor, yet chose instead to transform symbols of safety into instruments of deliberate destruction. Back in the comfortable familiarity of Baker Street, Holmes arranged Whitmore's copper apparatus upon our mantelpiece as a reminder of ingenuity perverted to criminal purpose. Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock announced the evening post, and among the correspondence lay a telegram bearing the distinctive urgency that invariably preceded our next adventure. "Another puzzle presents itself, Watson," Holmes announced with evident satisfaction, his brief melancholy replaced by renewed anticipation. "The bell of Raven's Point rings no more, yet London's mysteries continue their eternal symphony. Your hat, my dear fellow. There is work to be done." Thus concluded our investigation of the lighthouse that rang a bell after midnight, a case that demonstrated how the impossible merely indicates the limits of current understanding, and how patient observation combined with logical analysis can illuminate even the most elaborate deceptions conceived by criminal minds.